Worthington, whose family has lived in the Lawyers Hill area since the 18th century.
Turnpike, as it was called, and the Lawyers Hill Road, which was 1886, was well established.
Mm-hmm.
This was the house Maplewood that I was talking about. And you can see the houses dotted along here.
Right.
As part of it. This was the house Maplewood, and then Bank House. I think I probably dotted these roads. I don't know whether I dotted the roads or not. The Bank was part of Mrs. Anna M. Murray's. I don't know why the house doesn't show, but it doesn't. It was about. I think there's an area here. I think actually the Daniel Murray house was right here, and then this was Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And then this was Huggleworth. They pronounce it Hawkfat with the right pronunciation. So those three houses were old. The Bank was built, I'm guessing, 1850-ish, 1860, around the Civil War time. The Huggleworth house was built in, well, there was some house there. My great-grandparents bought it and lived there in 1855, and there was a house there already that they enlarged.
So maybe early 19th century.
Yeah. There were these two houses. Really, is one house, which is a residence still, and then this was a large house called Tutbury that was up on the hill.
Now, this is Montgomery,
yes.
Right? And these survive, but on the other side of 95?
Yes, several of them survived. Rockburn's gone, Bank's gone. It burned in the 1940s, but its stone stable and carriage house is still there. I have a picture of it, which I'll show you, and it survives. And it now belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church as a graveyard. And the Huggleworth house, which is my house, still survives. These two, I think one of these is a barn, if I'm not mistaken, but the house still survives, and this house here, called Tutbury, still survives. So they were all, as you can see, there were sort of two parts to Lawyers Hill. These houses here are, well, this Mrs. Waters' house is gone. The Dorsey house is still there, and
now which one is?
That's now called the Gables.
Oh, the Gables.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it still belongs to Bob's Stead. I don't know.
No, actually,
it's been sold.
Yeah, it's been sold, and this has been subdivided here. So the district has been sort of redefined around the new subdivision.
Well, this was never really part of Lawyers Hill. I don't know. Mr. Stead bought the whole thing. I guess it was all available. I don't know why he bought the whole thing, but it always had this sort of corridor that went back towards the Washington Boulevard. In fact, I think there was a road that came on through here. It was joined. But the other houses up here, the Shriver house, I think that's this one, is still there. But it's really Montgomery Road. It was never a strong part of Lawyers Hill. There are little houses along here that are new that weren't there until fairly recently. There's a house here that's still there. I think it's for sale. The house here is still there. Then it sort of fades here. It's a little hard to see.
Now, which one is that? One right next door to the Gables?
No, the one next door to the Gables is back here.
Yeah.
And this one is closer to the road. I don't know how well do you know the area?
I've walked around it a couple of times.
You may remember that you come down a hill. The Dorsey house, which was the Gables, is at the bottom of the hill. In other words, it's sort of a relatively flat area here, and then you drop down to the bottom of the hill, and then climb back up here. And this house I was talking about is just on, which is not in here, is near the top of the hill. Incidentally, there were two big hills, really, And this place across here was called the Great Divide. Not in the extent of a continental divide that's the top of the hill. This was the bottom of the hill. But there was a road that came from here. There was a road that came up the Rockburn branch. Was called, and up to here was called the Rockburn Road.
Right, which still exists, but it's
some of it,
been cut
yes,
off.
yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the Great Divide, so-called, was before the Lawyers Hill Road. It came up from that Rockburn branch of the Rockburn Road, as it was called. It came up here to this Dorsey house. And the Dorseys were, and I don't know, there were probably other roads along this way too. I don't know how, I forget when the Lawyers Hill Road was put through, but it was...
I think it was the later part of the 1960s. I believe it was Dobbins.
Yeah, it was, and it was put through. There was an old Lawyers Hill Road. I don't mean this one down here. There's now the old Lawyers Hill Road, but there was an old Lawyers Hill Road, and then the road was straightened. And because I know that happened probably around 1900, and it was paved. I guess maybe it was after 1900. It was probably paved for automobiles. And then, of course, this part here was where the Lawyers Hill Road, well, Lawyers Hill really started. It did move this way. Well, it moved both ways, actually. These people were generally not, they were from Baltimore, whereas these people came out, most of them came from Rockburn and Belmont, and the two sort of joined. And there was a great deal of overlap in their marriage.
Yes.
Really complicated in their marriage. I'll show you something on that in a little while.
Yeah.
But, and the Dobbins, the Donaldsons, the Latrobes, there were others. Leverings, I guess, came fairly early. You probably know that better than I do, when people actually came there. But the Latrobes, Dobbins, and Donaldsons were more or less the start. But as far as I know it. Now, there were other things down here. The Hockley Mill existed, and the Hockley House, which is up in here somewhere. These little houses didn't amount to much. They were, I think, tenant houses. And people related to the ironworks. The ironworks here at Avalon that was the Dorsey business, and there were quite a few houses in the Patapsco Valley. Then when the Ellicott City flood took them all out, which I think was 1866, I believe. 68. 68. Okay, that sort of went away, and the few that were on high ground stayed around, but they were still not really too much of the neighborhood. And Hockley was not really part of this. The Hockley House and Hockley Mill were not really part of the neighborhood, the Lawyers Hill neighborhood. Because, as you know, this is a pretty steep hill, and it served as a dividing line. The lawn.
Do you know when the new Lawyers Hill Road?
Yeah, this one
in?
that goes down here to the Relay Bridge. Wait a minute. The other one goes down. Well, I guess no. All right, the new one comes down along here
this
somewhere.
This is the old one.
That's the old one, yes.
And then, do you know when that came in?
No, I don't. I suspect it came in with automobiles. I do know. It was after 1900. Do know that. The reason I know that, my grandfather at that time had a bicycle with the big wheel. Right. And he insisted upon getting in a contest with somebody and riding it up the old Lawyers Hill Road, which was really steep, and had a heart attack. And he didn't die then, but he died not too many years afterwards, about 1905, as a result. And so that was remembered in family history.
Yes, I'm sure.
But so it's after around 1900. I suspect that was for the automobile too. And of course, I don't know how long they had the railroad, the walkway on the railroad bridge. I guess all along they must have.
That was original.
Because the address, by the way, for the people here was St. Denis Post Office. Until not too, let's see, that was until after 1900, I think. I think I have some letters addressed there.
Well, I found that a rather interesting part of the research. Something that's come out is that all of the references to Lawyers Hill of the 19th century link it to Relay, not to Elkridge, which which today seems so much closer. And you think, considering the huge physical boundary there.
Mm-hmm. Well, this bridge, of course, had a lot to do with that. But,
right.
But now I don't know of any. Incidentally, I don't know of any other bridges above the one right about here. It moved around. It would wash out, and they put it back in again.
The road bridge.
The road bridge.
Mm-hmm.
But the railroad was the link to Baltimore for Lawyers Hill. I mean, it's the reason Lawyers Hill was able to move out there, because people could then commute fairly easily in the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, who lived up here, was an electrical engineer and sold electric automobiles. And around about 1895 or so, he had an automobile in which he would drive to Baltimore. His business was in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a peculiar automobile. It was a four-wheel drive electric automobile. And it was about the only thing that could make it down that road to Baltimore. It was in such bad condition. And my parents talk about this road being a terrible road even in the early 1900s, when they remember it, as being just hip deep in mud. And so that's...
Now tell me what became of some of the other properties through here. There's a lot of subdivision and a number of later houses. I don't think. Maybe
well,
one or
let's see. Maybe a good thing to do would be to just sort of walk down, figuratively walk down the road, and try and pick up all of them. And I'm wondering what I have that you said you had seen these things. Maryland Historical Trust.
Yes, the surveys. Yes.
And that I think it's not complete. At least my papers aren't complete. There's some houses left out. But I'm wondering if maybe...
I have a feeling there were some surveys that were listed and given numbers and never done.
That's
at least with the
Latrobe
property, that's the case.
Yeah, and I the first to tell you that I'm weak on remembering which house is which. I'm guilty of, like so many of us are, listening to my parents and grandparents talk about it and not being interested. Mm-hmm. And I wish I had. So I'm not able to tell you, not always sure of which house is which and what's happened to them. I know them fairly well recently. Okay, this you're not interested in, I believe, because this is the old Elkridge itself. This is the Washington Turnpike, the railroad bridge at Relay, and the railroad, showing the old mill race of the first mill. Mm-hmm. But that wouldn't be of particular interest to you. So I'm just wondering if I don't have some of these have maps with them that might be better, maybe will serve to remind me of where things were. Just glance at a couple of them. Maybe before, okay, that looks like probably the same, probably the same map as I've got there. Maybe not. This is,
more of the
it's
north.
Yeah, and it's a different scale.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the one we had there is better. So I don't think this is going to, it's all the same thing. I don't think that's going to maybe what best, I don't know, you know, whatever suits you. Let me show you everything I've got, and we can sort of filter out what would be useful to you.
Okay.
And then see what's best to spend time on, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, come on in. I got stuff. That type of house. That's a different house, but it says shingle, a lot of brown stained shingles, and a real fire trap. This house burned, Ellebank burned, and several others burned about the same time. Because this is the Rookby house, the first Rookby house, and they were made with, because they weren't insulated, and the walls had no fire stops in them, so that once a fire started, it just went up like going up a chimney.
And so these were also built as summer houses. They're like the ones.
This one was built. My grandfather built this, and I think he really built it with the intention of living there full time. Mm-hmm. But they did live in Baltimore in the winter. They had an apartment in Baltimore. I guess it was more or less.
So it was typical. What he did was typical of what.
Yeah. With a lot of the people here, it was a matter of could they afford to put heat in, and also there wasn't that much heat available at that time. There was fireplaces and so on. And of course, that's what caused many of these to burn down. What happened to many of these, they during World War II, with fuel shortage and coal shortage, they reactivated the fireplaces, and that did in quite a few old houses. One right here, this Ivy Neck house, was the same way. It was a beautiful big house, and it burned down about the same time. So anyway, that's those two houses, and about all that map covers. I'll just sort of set this stuff aside. That's Elkridge Landing. You're not interested in 1732 or 17 something.
No, that's a little.
Right. These are just. I wasn't sure you're interested in Elkridge. You asked if there was a newspaper at Elkridge. There was not a newspaper that I found any record of, but I found a Elkridge Lyceum that says under there. And I can't imagine what the Elkridge Landing Lyceum was or where it was. But apparently, this was my great-grandfather. Apparently, he went there to school or whatever you did in the Lyceum. And I have a number of his books that have the same sticker in it.
I have not heard of, seen a reference to that.
Well, let's see. He lived. He died in the 1850s. He was a doctor and living in Laurel then. So he was the Elkridge Lyceum probably. Let's see. His wife came from England in 1792 as a very young child. She was born in 1780-something. So he must have been out at Elkridge in very early 1800s. And then this was another one that I'm interested in for several reasons, and wondered if you had seen anything on Selby Mill. It was at Elkridge somewhere. And I have the reason all this is connected. When my wife and I decided to fix up the cottage, which was the Hopeworth residence, we discovered inside a little house that had obviously been there when the big house was built. It was always called the cottage, and it was a huge house. It was really three houses stuck together. And I remember asking my grandmother why, and she said, well, it was a cottage when her parents had bought it. And it was a little cottage under a big poplar tree. And so when I was putting electricity and water and so on into the house and heat, I found the cottage inside the house. And, they just lived in it probably while they built. And digging through the attic floor of what had been the little cottage, I found this book, which is it's a register of, or a record of accounts of a mill. And in this, there are a lot of references, and these would be people who lived in the Elkridge and Lawyers Hill area of, I think the date's 1850-ish, 1854, for example. You'll find a lot of the names of the people. In fact, I think he's got the names. An index out front. Well, there's Thomas Donaldson, who was one of the lawyers of Lawyers Hill. And if you really wanted to dig into some of these people, the Gambrels were at Lawyers Hill. Hansons were at Belmont. A lot of the names, of course, I don't recognize. If you really wanted to dig, and you know how you can go forever on something like this. You can get in here and see what they bought, what they sold, how much they paid, and things like that.
Well, Rockburn, I've seen references to Rockburn Branch as sawmill.
Yes, right. Okay. And I was wondering, would this mill was clearly, this mill here was clearly a grain mill, because you find in here
wheat.
Yeah. This was the cash account, which is nails, paper, all that kind of stuff like that. But when you get over here to the individual's account, like Michael Smith's account, he bought lots of flour and middlings and stuff like that, and he sold his services, work, 1 month for $25. Which, of course, that can get interesting. You can get off on that. Yeah. And here again, this George Worthington, who was brother of this fellow, I believe, or nephew, was also same sort of thing, except
brown stuff.
Yeah, I think. Well, middlings, I finally learned that's a grade of flour. It's not as good as the white flour. I think it's probably white flour, middlings, and brown stuff. That's what the floor sweepings, I guess.
Boy.
But the reason I'm pretty sure that the Worthingtons were involved in this mill is that whenever you get to an account of a Worthington, it's not just flour and this is grain and flour over here, but there's grain and flour on this side of the account. And I think there's I don't know whether there's a John Worthington, John Y. Worthington here or not. There's George Y. and John Y. And John Y was on 22, and I'm sure that's the same guy. The Y was Yellett, which was their mother's family. I've just been tracing them in England. I got them over in Yorkshire in a place called Silkstone in the 1600s. So also over here you see John Y is doing a lot of. Well, actually these seem to be debits brought up to here, so it's not clear. But their accounts are very different from everybody else's. So this is why I think this Selby mill was probably the grain mill, and not the sawmill. But it could, they on occasion would convert one to another. Now the mill, as far as I can make out, was right where Rockburn Branch goes into the Patapsco River. I'm pretty sure of that. The old Branch Road, as it was called, the old Rockburn Road, was built on the mill race, and you can see for I guess it's a half a mile or close to it. It was flat. It followed the contour, so it was almost flat, and it's considerably above the Rockburn Branch where it goes into the river, like maybe 50 feet or so. So they got a good fall for operating the mill. So it could have been either a sawmill, and Rockburn Branch was called Sawmill Branch originally, before Rockburn was built. Rockburn got its name certainly probably no earlier than the 1830s. That's the first reference I've seen to the name, I think, was 1836.
So now, why do you think this says Selby Mill on it? Do you think that's where they were operating the mill?
I suspect that the mill at one point belonged to a Mr. Selby. I'm just guessing this.
Yeah.
And that he sold it to John Worthington, or John Worthington rented it from him, or something like that. And probably had a house. Mills frequently had a house associated with it. I'm going to be working in the Worthington history, if I ever finish this learning stuff I'm doing, and look into that some more. And then Hattersley Worthington, who was, the Dr. Hattersley Worthington that I showed you with the Elkridge Lyceum book had an uncle, John, and he had a grandfather, John. So, and it was all Yellets, with a lot of Yellets in there with the Y initial. So, I'm not too clear on how that goes. Now, this book could be interesting, depending on the time you wanted to spend it, just to see what Lawyers Hill members were here, and you get a feel for their life when you find out how much flour they bought and how they paid, and if they paid, and I don't know the other names. I'm not. F.K. Murray was at Rockburn. The Trubs were across Lawyers Hill, and Pocock was Elkridge. some of these names I won't know. But something I'd really like to know is, how did this book happen to get in the attic of my other great-grandparents' house? It was not the Worthington, it was the other side of the family. So I don't know how that happened. And I may never. I don't know. My great-grandparents bought their little cottage from a man named Jackson, who was a farmer. Maybe he bought it from the Worthingtons, I don't know. They were all over that area.
Was that just alone, or was it with other books?
It was with other books, but a mix of all kinds of things. Of Worthington. It was in my. It was in the Rugby House, the new Rugby House, which was my uncle's, and died just about 6 or 8 years ago when I was executive for the estate, and the books were all shuffled. In fact, my aunt did a good job of shuffling absolutely everything before she died. When I first got involved in it, somebody told me how to go see that their son refused to help them, and I was a nephew, and there wasn't anybody else, so they said, you better do something. And so I went to see them, and my aunt had a dining room table that was as big as this room, and it was heaped like this. She'd taken every piece of paper in the house and piled it on the table. She was obviously senile. And over the months after that, I sorted through that table and found unpaid telephone bills of the 1940s and valid stock certificates and who knows what else, everything in between, old books, charts, maps, letters. And I've been trying to sort that out ever since. A lot of it had to do with the Murray family in Rockford. I'm in the middle of something on that. Okay, what else I have? This is a genealogical notebook, which I'm sure you might be interested in the existence of it. I don't think you want to get into, but it's the genealogy of the cover says, genealogical record of the Murray, Dorsey, Manadir, Hill, Enners, and other ancestors of the Murrays of Rockford. And it is detailed and pretty good. In other words, it has references and it's almost legible, except some other people have gotten hold of it and added their notes, which didn't help. But I've been researching this fairly heavily for the last several years, and just certain parts of it. I don't have a lot of it. But this does have a lot of the people that ended up being in Lawyers Hill. Again, that one I don't think would be terribly interesting. This I brought out just because it was a notebook that apparently or a memory book or something that my grandfather, who's named Donaldson and lived at the place I call the cottage, who he kept at the time of his father's death. His father was a relatively well-known physician. And it's obituaries and letters about it, but it contains letters from people from Lawyers Hill, or who lived at Lawyers Hill. And it's just sort of would give a snapshot of that date of who was involved in Lawyers Hill. Another thing I've got, this is something my great-grandfather who lived at the cottage place wrote, Recollections from an Octogenarian. He wrote about his life. Unfortunately, he died before he really finished. Some of this is about Lawyers Hill, and I think would be interesting. A lot of it, he was a little bit of everything. At one point, he was he colored the market on cotton duck, and then steamboats came in, and they didn't need sailcloth anymore. And he lost a lot of money in the sugar business in the Civil War, and so he lost a lot of money, let's put it that way. But he was very much involved with people like Johns Hopkins and so on in Baltimore. So it's interesting from that standpoint, but of course it's not related to Lawyers Hill. But there is a lot about Lawyers Hill. As you pick it up here, you'll see the reference to it. I suggest that you might want to make a copy of this and read through it. It's the kind of thing that it takes you an hour or so to struggle through. And I noticed what's on the other side of it might be of interest. This was his golden wedding anniversary and an account of it, and it mentions a little bit about Lawyers Hill and then also lists people who attended. Again, a list of people, and this is 1904.
Familiar names.
Yeah, Dobbins and Dorseys and Lowndes and Murrays and so on. the Hoodworth name, as they pronounced it there, was always sort of a joke in the neighborhood. You know, he was first of all, he was the only non-English or Scottish derived person, and secondly, he more or less sided with the North rather than the South. Mm-hmm. And as you know, lawyers, you know about the founding of the Hall, the Elkridge Assembly Room, I assume, as a
related to
the North and South. Yeah. Oh. The idea was to keep the neighbors on speaking terms with each other, and a rule was never discuss the war or politics at the Hall, and that was partly so almost Samuel Hoodworth could attend. I have recently got involved years ago in Holland and his family. And that's a very interesting sidelight, but that has nothing to do with Lawyer's Hill. This, I thought, if you wanted to take it along, this is the book I told you about I've been working on Daniel Murray of Rockburn. Now, there's not a great deal about Lawyer's Hill here, but I thought if you want this, this is my old working copy. It's got errors in it and changes, and I don't need it anymore. So you're welcome to that.
Oh, sure.
It might be of interest to you, and that you don't need to copy. This, I'm sure you'd be interested in. It's a book. And I don't have part one. I'm told it's I just talked to someone yesterday, a Donaldson, who said she'll send me a part one and I can copy it. She said it's the most interesting volume. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's about Lawyer's Hill particularly, but this has a lot about the two Davis and Donaldson families. Mm-hmm. A lady named Charlotte Donaldson married a Jim Davis, and that's how the two families got connected. Davis was the founder of the Davis and Hempel machine screw factory in Elkridge, and they both had a lot to do with Lawyer's Hill, both families. And this has a lot in it that I think you'll find interesting about Lawyer's Hill. Of course, if I look for it, I'll never find. Some of this, of course, goes way back, but you really have to just start at the beginning and leaf through, and you'll find all sorts of neat things on Lawyer's Hill here. Probably the best, most thorough collection of accounts. These were collected by Ms. Schauber from her. Charlotte Donaldson was her sister-in-law, and she got all of her papers, and then also their fathers and grandfathers on back several generations. So she had a lot of stuff, and a lot of the Donaldsons I can also. In fact, the residents of Lawyer's Hill, their biggest accomplishment, if anything, was telling stories, true and untrue. And Tom Donaldson, the various Donaldsons were particularly good at it. And the recreation in my grandfather's day was to sit around and tell stories to each other. And so, of course, a lot of these stories were about the family and or about the neighbors and so on. So a lot of gossip got into it, but it gives a pretty good picture of the people. This volume here now has an index, and that's its main use to me. I forget what the rest of this. Well, no, this also has all stuff in here too, but there's all sorts of other stuff too. And I would be delighted to let you make a copy of this. I wouldn't give you this because it's my only copy and you can't get them anymore. Yeah. Now, I'm promised part one someday, and I'll make a Xerox of it for myself. But I think that would have more information than anything I have here. Another thing I have that I think might be of interest, this was a scrapbook my grandfather, and you're probably getting tired of standing up and sit down for a minute.
I want to grab the map again.
I can bring this in then because this is. Let me explain about my grandfather a little bit so you'll know what's in here. His father was a well-known doctor, as I mentioned earlier. And he and his brother were real playboys. That's the only way to describe it. He went to Princeton, and he got thrown out of Princeton for rioting, I think in his sophomore year. And then he came home and went to Johns Hopkins, and he flunked out of there after about a year. So then he decided he was going to be an electrical engineer, and he hung up his sign in Baltimore and was very successful at it. And because that's all you had to do was to just say you were one. This was in 1890s.
And this is George?
And no, this was, his name was William Donaldson.
William Donaldson.
Yeah. And different grandfather.
Uh-huh.
And his real interest in life seemed to be the theater more than anything else. In fact, he and his brother, both felt that way. And his brother was worse than he was. His brother never was successful at anything except spending his father's money. And this is several accounts in here of William Donaldson's father saying, this is to, for your record, I have sent your brother another $100. This will be the last $100 I ever send him, and take it out of it comes out of his inheritance. And then 2 months later, I had to send Frank another $100.
This is really fun.
And finally, they incidentally, the family these were all very heavily into Baltimore society, these people, and they married Frank off to some society woman in Baltimore. And after a couple of years, they had several children. And after a couple of years, he disappeared, and was suddenly discovered in San Francisco on the stage, married to somebody else, not having gotten a divorce from wife number one. And the somebody else was the daughter of the governor of Rhode Island, who had also run away from home and gone on the stage. So that was part of it. But my grandfather, he behaved himself a little bit better. He didn't get caught or something. But then he rode his bicycle up the hill and then died early of a heart attack. Mm-hmm. But his interest was the theater. And he met my grandmother really through the activities of the Elkridge Assembly Room, now called the Hall. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of information about the Hall, and I'm sure you know that Elkridge originally meant the ridge of land that extends from where Lawyer's Hill is now, on down and eventually becomes the Cliffs of Colbert in Colbert County. Mm-hmm. Comes right through here. There's a house back here called the Ridge, mm-hmm. And it was originally Elkridge. Same ridge. It's geologically the same. Mm-hmm. Right. And it was the first high ground when you came up away from Tidewood. It was important because it was the head of navigation, and it was that's why Elkridge Landing was there. That's how far ships could get. Mm-hmm. And it was the site of a fairly important old Indian trail, because the Indians would go where they could get across the river, wade across the river and forth. And it was also in healthy air, because you didn't have malaria when you got up onto the high ground. Mm-hmm. And so when they speak of Elk Ridge, they're really talking of that whole ridge. You may know, when you don't know, you know about the Elkridge Club in Baltimore?
Yes.
Okay, that was an old fox hunting club, right. Or fox hunting club, and it started at Elkridge, at what we now know as Elkridge. You know the Hunt Club Road?
Yes. Okay,
it was on that. And the house is still there. The building is still there.
It is. But it dead ends at 95, so it's between 95 and Montgomery?
Yes, if you're going from it actually doesn't. It comes from US 1, and it hits 95, and then there's a piece of it that turns and goes down, enters opposite Lawyer's Hill Road, enters the Montgomery Road. Mm-hmm. And if you're coming from the Washington Boulevard side, mm-hmm. There's a vertical board house on the right that was the Hunt Club. Mm-hmm. It was expanded, and it was the Dorsey family who were big in fox hunting, and they founded it, and so that is not, just another example of Elkridge. So when they talked about the Elkridge Assembly Rooms, they meant the up on Elkridge. And that's why the hall got that name, though it was on Lawyer's Hill. They always referred, and even when I was young, they always referred to what's now Elkridge as Elkridge Landing, or the Landing. Mm-hmm. They never called it just plain Elkridge. Mm-hmm. And usually, the older people always spelled it as two words, Elkridge. Mm-hmm. I would be corrected when I wrote it with I learned in school to write it. I went to Elkridge Elementary School, and they had one word then, and I was confused between my...
What about Lawyer's Hill? How far back do you think that goes?
Well, I can't tell you the date, but it goes back to, you mean the actual first use of the name?
Right,
yeah.
I understand. I mean, in various people's accounts, it says, well, it developed this name because lawyers settled there, but...
Yeah. Who first used it? Yeah.
You know what point it...
No, that book, that right up that I'll give you the copy, the Remembrances of an Octogenarian, he was there, I presume. Well, no, maybe he wasn't. He probably didn't move out until 1850 something.
Mm-hmm.
But he probably mentions it. And I guess, I don't know how you'd find that out except just looking for letters.
References and documents and deeds and
yeah.
The road itself got the name.
Yeah.
I think, I guess the earliest reference I've seen is probably the late 19th century.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a good couple of generations, I think, before the name really.
And there were some doctors and others who resented the name. My great-grandfather, who was one of the settlers there, was a doctor.
Yeah, it was the Donaldsons, huh?
Yeah, he was the Donaldson. And he...
There's Dr. Hall.
Yeah,
too.
Yeah, right. Now, what this has in it that might be of interest to you, and I'll have to look through it quickly. I think initially this is mostly stuff from Princeton, but this Elkridge Assembly Room too, when he was going to Princeton. So I think we have to get him thrown out of Princeton first, which was fairly early. But every now and then you get well, for instance here, private theatricals at Elkridge, the assembly rooms at Elkridge are mentioned there, and what these little articles do, and it would take some considerable time to go through this all. What they do is they list often who was in the play, the date of it, and who was in it. For instance, here, Elkridge Assembly Rooms, and I think it's interesting. Trains leave Baltimore at these times. It was a big deal. It was sort of like it was a summer theater, and it says, well, Mr. William Donaldson, Mr. Henry Steele, Mr. Frank Donaldson, Mr. Ralph Latimer. Incidentally, they pronounced that Rafe, but they were all residents of Lawyer's Hill at that time, and generally you can be reasonably sure that the people they list in the plays were residents of Lawyer's Hill. And it really was, in some sense, sort of a theater-oriented summer residence. This is mixed with stuff like he and his brother running for assaulting a policeman. But then you have other things like the Elkridge grand opening of the Elkridge Theater. I presume that means grand opening that year, which apparently is 1880, and a list of who was in it. Okay.
So it was a lot more than just a theater for Lawyer's Hill.
Yeah, it wasn't just a little fun group. Mm-hmm. It was. It apparently attracted people from Baltimore. I mean, they ran trains out, timed
especially
for the theater, and the trains returning at the end of the play. Sometimes you'll see it here. Train will return half an hour after the end of the performance or something like that. I certainly remember when you could go down to the relay station and get a train at least every half an hour to Baltimore during most of the day. And they don't even stop at Relay. I think they may stop at Elkridge occasionally, maybe one or two a day in commuter trains. You would be welcome to look through this, spend as much time as you wanted looking through it. A lot of this is just going to be the theater in Baltimore, because Baltimore was the full season, and he would go to every play there was. And then the scene would shift to New York when he was at Princeton. He spent most of his time, I think, going to New York or plays at Princeton. And on and on like that. You can pick up almost anywhere in here and you'll find some, that looks like examinations and Princeton stuff. It was quite a mix. Still Princeton. Just when you're looking for them, on things. But Elkridge Assembly, basically what happens is every summer you come across Elkridge Assembly along. I guess that's what it was always called.
He was quite an archivist.
Yeah, and some of this would be interesting. I think someone in the theater, like Lily Langtry, we went to see everything Lily Langtry was in. And then there also, there'll be their newspaper accounts and things like that. So
at this point, the Donaldson family was living at the
the Hoogerwerf, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel Hoogerwerf was the one who built the house twice. His wife was a she was a Dorsey. That's how they happened to be out there. And her sister lived at the Gables, or the Dorsey. That was also called the Dorsey House. I think that's what brought them out. When her sister was married Mr. Dorsey. That can't be right, because she was I don't know, a lot of Dorseys married Dorseys, which really confused things. I'm not sure exactly. But anyway, that the relationship with the Dorsey family brought them out. And then Mr. Hoover, who was in Baltimore, his father was a Dutchman in the wine business. And so that's what brought him to Baltimore. And he came out there, married, and then my grandfather, Dobinson, obviously, was related to the Donaldson family, the same as Thomas Donaldson. Mm-hmm. And that brought him out there. He met my grandmother there through the theater, and they moved into the house. I guess took care of the Hooverwerfs, who lived forever. And so eventually it became my grandfather died. My grandmother and her brother, who was an admiral in the Navy, inherited it. And then my grandmother bought her brother out and lived there, and then she left it to me when she died, which was, I don't know, 50-something. Lady support group. They took care of each other. And she would move in. She lived, many years she lived at the Lawn, at the Browns. Mm-hmm. Miss Esther Brown was a friend of hers, and Dr. George Brown. And she lived also in Baltimore, and she lived over at Berkeley with my other grandmother. And she lived there until the 1st of April. On the 1st of April, she'd come back out and open up the house. It was routine, and I suspect that was the same routine that her parents
and other families
probably followed that. I would guess that. Yeah. They would get into, apparently they would, part of it was they would celebrate Thanksgiving out of Lawyer's Hill, mm-hmm. traditionally. Those people, besides liking to tell stories to each other, also like to eat. And they would combine the activities frequently. So they would have their Thanksgiving dinner out there. Very often several families getting together, really big deals. And then they would get into town in time for Christmas. And I guess April 1st was just sort of the date when they could get out and start planting their gardens and things like that. They were all avid gardeners, I believe. I know my grandmother was. In fact, she made a living as a gardener for a while, selling jellies and jams and fresh fruit and so on.
And were you, did you spend all of your childhood at Maplewood?
No, I was born in Baltimore, and then I think the first year or so, my parents lived at Maplewood and shared it. This was 1932, so a Depression time when my father was out of work, everybody was out of work, and they had two families in Maplewood. Another family shared with us. And then we moved from there to at Brooklyn. There was a cottage. We moved into Brooklyn Cottage for
quite a few years, I guess, until I was probably 7 years old, 8 years old maybe. And but we would move over to the cottage at Lawyers Hill for the summer. I don't know exactly why. I guess maybe liked it better. With my other grandmother, a break. It changed grandmothers anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And that it was at that time when I was about 10 and my wife was 9, and my wife rented out Maplewood next door. And but we kept going back to the little cottage at Worthington each one. And then it was 1941 that we moved away from Lawyers Hill to a place called Orange Grove, about 3 miles up the river. That had to do with my grandmother didn't want. We wanted to fix up the house, my grandmother Donaldson's house, with heating and so on. And she said okay, and then towards the end of summer she forgot that she had said that, and we couldn't do it, so we had to move away. But then my wife and I moved back to the cottage and fixed it up later, and we were married after my grandmother died.
Mm-hmm.
And we lived there from 58 until 65, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. What, and so as a child living there, we were living there pretty around then. I mean, at least in that general area.
Yes, yeah, we were in there.
And going to Elkridge.
Went to Elkridge Elementary School until I was, through 7th grade, so I was 13, I was 31, 44.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to high school down in Virginia, boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was an only child, so my parents thought I better get away from home, which was, I suppose, a good idea. I didn't like the idea at the time.
Did you look forward to going back during some?
Yeah, I was always very happy there in the summertime because it was warm. And in the wintertime, I was very happy at Elkridge School because it was warm. At home, it was not. It was, my parents were believers in opening all the windows at night, and there wasn't any heat. And the result was it was awfully cold. And I was cold like most of my childhood, it seems. We lived, when we moved away from Lawyers Hill up to a place called Orange Grove, I would walk down the river road to the foot of Rockburn Hill Road, right where Rockburn Branch goes in. And a bunch of kids would wait there for the bus. I can remember how cold it was because somebody threw me off the bridge into Rockburn Branch and it was warm. I just remember there was ice on everything. So I can remember that as being warm. I think I got him later with a baseball bat, and warmed myself up beating on him with the bat probably. But school was warm, the bus was warm, and I liked school for that reason. It was probably good for me.
As a child, were you participating in the social activities with your parents, with the other Lawyers family?
Yeah. The social activities, the big event was the 4th of July picnic at the hall. I don't know whether you already...
Still big.
It's still carried on. At that time, if I can believe what I heard, that there was pretty good tennis playing there. I mean, really high-level tennis. Not Wimbledon, but
at where?
At the hall.
Really? It doesn't seem to have a large enough lot, does it?
Well, it has, if you are facing from the Lawyers Hill Road, if you face the hall to the right, are the tennis courts, which are one court, flat clay court. And a lot of effort was put into the court. There were a lot of courts in the area, too. Rockburn had 4 courts, for example. And many of the other houses would have that tennis court. It was a big thing. And there were people who went on to become, they were called East Coast champion and things like that. Now, what that meant, I'm not sure. I don't know how many people competed in that.
And was that open to Lawyers Hill residents who were part of the...
Members of the hall. And they weren't just Lawyers Hill residents. They paid the dues and usually somehow related. And there was a lot of, I think there was a lot of politics that went on into getting into the hall. When new people would move into the neighborhood, they'd sort of check them out for a year or two before they let them join the hall, or before they get up courage to ask to become members. But most everybody that came to Lawyers Hill was related. There was one family that was not related, named this was the Stead family, and they came from Washington, and they were outsiders, definitely. I forget how they found out about the hall, or about Lawyers Hill, but anyway they did. And it took a while before they were accepted, not too long, but it took several years. And I had an aunt who never forgot that. And she then married at Lawyers Hill, married my uncle, so she was obviously accepted after a while.
But do you remember any of the homes that burned? I know a lot burned early in the century, but for instance, I've seen references to Windhurst.
Yeah, and I'm not sure which house Windhurst was. Do you know which family lived there?
I can't remember. Do you have the Lawyers Hill book, the history?
Well, I have two things that might say it. It might tell. Let me look at the index here first. It was W-Y-N-D, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes.
It's not in here. Okay, maybe, why don't I go through these and I don't recognize many of these by the names they give them here. I have to.
I can tell you which one. This is the one next to the gables.
Next to the gables, okay. I always called it the purple house. It used to be, at one time, it's a brown shingle.
Yes.
But it was purple color. I remember it's purple color. Okay, I don't know a great deal about this house. It was belonged to the McSherry family at one time for quite a while, and they and the McSherry family and the Shriver family were closely allied. They were strong Catholics, and this made them a little bit outsiders in Lawyers Hill, which was primarily a Episcopal church neighborhood. The Shrivers lived. There was one Shriver that lived up next to Montgomery Road. I think his name was on here. Yes, there. E.H. Shriver. And there were one or two other Shrivers. I know my friends. And my wife has some Shriver ancestry. So I've been in that house, but I don't remember anything about it. And this says everything that I would know and then some. Armagh, I knew that was my mother-in-law's house, stepmother-in-law's house. You know which house that is?
Yes.
Okay, the sort of square thing. I, as a kid, my main interest in that was the fact that Mrs. Dobbin raised cats, and raised Persian cats, and raised and sold them, and had this huge thing that my father was the architect for, a cattery, and she must have had
a cattery.
A cattery. I must have had 50 cats back there, or maybe more. I don't know. And it was. It since got torn down, but it was kind of a nice looking little aisleway with a roof with cages on each side.
Oh my goodness, that could possibly be the one and only cattery
No. But
do you remember it? Are there pictures?
I don't have. No, I couldn't find any pictures. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of it. I just remember that it stuck out from the back of the house. The house, as you know, is on a steep hill, and it stuck out from the back of the house, and it was quite long.
Attached to the house.
Yeah, and it seems to me it may have stepped down on a couple of occasions because the slope was so great. It was this long aisleway, and I would follow along while she fed the cats, which was quite a deal. She had the big bucket of cat food, and into each cage as she went by.
Did she raise them for breeding?
Yeah, raising them. Incidentally,
sorry, just one genealogical connection. Your mother-in-law was?
Anne Dobbin was her maiden name. She is still alive and quite alert, but has emphysema. She's in a nursing home in Baltimore. I don't know whether she might be a person to talk to. I don't know. I don't know whether she'd want to or not. She can't really talk much. She gets out of breath, and so I think probably she would not want to be interviewed. I don't know. The next chance I get, I'll
And she was what relation to
and,
Robert?
And she was Robert Gross's granddaughter, I guess. Okay, I don't know whether this probably does. I mean, Robert Dobbin, excuse me. Let me see if I've got the Dobbin tree here. Probably not, because I don't believe they were. But I was trying to think of who were the old people. You know, she's not in here. This might tell me how she's related. I was trying to think who are the old people that knew Lawyer Hill better than I do, and she's one of them. She was. There were about, I think there were 5 sisters and 1 brother that lived at Harmon, which incidentally was named after the family. The family came from Harmon in Ireland. And I think they've all died, with her exception. She was the youngest, I believe, or second youngest. She first married a man named Charles Carroll, who was a lawyer at Elkridge City. And they lived at the Shriver House up here, right on, really on Montgomery Road. And they were living there while I was a baby over here at Maplewood. And so her son, Charlie Carroll, and I probably have known him longer, with her exception, I've known him longer than anybody else. And then many years, Charlie Carroll died, and my wife's mother died, and many years later, Ann Dobbin married as her second husband my wife's father as his second wife. So she became, through that route, became my stepmother-in-law, I guess is the right term.
I see, okay.
Most of what I know about the Dobbin family, really, well, my parents seemed to be particularly my father seemed to be very good friends with that family. And of course, they were really one of the big starring families, political families in Rose Hill. And again, most of what I remember is just hearing story after story about funny things they did, amusing events, things like that. And I remember my stepmother-in-law's mother, who was named Beatrice Dobbin, and her father was George, so she must have been the granddaughter of Robert. Because
was George the judge, George? Or his son?
He was the son or grandson. It must have been probably grandson. No, that would have been Robert. I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. I think sometimes even the newspaper accounts. Wrong in
and then they all married each other. The Browns, there was a George Dobbin Brown and a George Brown Dobbin, and it's impossible to try and keep straight.
Genealogical nightmare.
So
with the exception of the cattery,
I don't
were there
remember
other
much else
changes?
about it. The house has been, there were.
It's a bigger property. It was 95.
Yes, I-95 got a lot of it. It extended all the way back to Rockburn Branch, I believe. Yeah. And it's, I always refer to it as funny-looking architecture, is the way I thought of it. But it was, I know my father did more work on it than just the cattery. It was maybe just interior work. It was small additions and changes. As I recall, I don't think he got paid for a long time.
That was about what year?
That would have been
Around a decade.
1920-ish, I think. Okay, now this is Dobbins House, Thomas Dobbins House. This is on Old Lawyers Hill Road, fairly close to the hall. I think maybe it was the next door to the hall. Don't think there's another house in there now, but I think this is that was added. Yeah, okay. I think it used to be this whole lot. That is the hall there. And then I think it probably was this whole lot, and then this piece was sold off to the Warriors. That's the authorities.
So it's Wayside then?
Yeah, that sounds right now.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, some of the places we always knew by their names, and others we never knew by the name. Wayside was one of those.
What's for the three Dobbins?
Yes, Miss Rita, Miss Anne, and Miss Jeanette, and they would come visit my grandmother, and they were like three little birds. They would come and light on the furniture, sit up right for me. One thing I have to tell you about, which was related to Lawyers Hill, there was all these ladies of my grandmother's generation went to a school called Miss Hall's Finishing School for Girls in Baltimore, and there were at least 9 of them that made up a baseball team. And unfortunately, I can't find the picture of them playing baseball. But they are all in long black dresses to the ground and lace-up black shoes and with big hats and veils and so on, batting up. It's a great picture. But these people, there was my 2 grandmothers, who were Miss Hochpfeff and Miss Ford, and became Mrs. Worthington, Ms. Nelson, Ms. Worthington. And then there was a Miss Murray, who became Mrs. Bowden at Rockburn. And then there was the 3 Mrs. Dobbins. It was their mother, I think her name was. And there was a Miss, no, that was not, there was a Miss Sophie Donaldson, a very proper old lady, a beautiful old lady. There was a Miss Shoemaker, Miss Biddle. No, she was, sorry, Miss Shoemaker became a Biddle. Because then there was a Miss, get the name, they had a land across, which was also in the family across the Patapsco River, which was also part of Belmont. But anyway, they were, at one time I knew all 9, but these were all very proper little old ladies, and many of them had financial problems in the Depression, in the Wall Street crash, including both my grandmothers. In fact, Mr. Bowden, the husband of one of these ladies, was the president of the Maryland Trust, which was the predecessor of Maryland National Bank, and he was supposedly took off with a good bit of the money of his share of the stock, anyway, of the trust, took off for England about 2 days before the crash, and precipitated the crash in Baltimore, really. The bank went down when he left, and he didn't come back until the statute of limitations ran out. And then died. And this was his wife, Miss Julia Bowden, always felt an obligation to my 2 grandmothers, and as did Miss Shoemaker, who became a Biddle, which was the Biddle family up in Philadelphia, which was a very wealthy family. And so these old ladies would sort of come around and visit the less fortunate old ladies, and I never knew what was going on, except my grandmothers were always felt much better after they left. What it was, they were leaving a little check, just to help out. And I only discovered this after, going through my grandmother's papers after they died, that they would drop a couple $100 each time they visited, which would get my grandmothers through. I remember one that I didn't remember it too well. My mother really remembered it, that it was Miss Duval. I think she was another member of the baseball team. And Miss Duval had a sapphire set into her front tooth. And my mother would sit around waiting for her to smile. And she would also drop $100. Why she had the sapphire, I don't know. I found out recently that this is a custom in the East, in the Far East, in China and so forth. And apparently this is a good way it's the way you preserve your wealth. And show your wealth, I guess, instead of a ring or whatever.
Huh.
Good way to get your teeth knocked out too, I think.
I'm sure, yeah.
But these old ladies were all very proper high society ladies. And Lawyers Hill was that sort of a place in their generation. But then it went downhill from there in my parents' generation, I think. My parents certainly, and many of the others, weren't comfortable with the society scene. Let's put it that way. They still sort of played the game. They would go to the what was then called the Assembly in Baltimore, which was the dances, the social gatherings, and so on. They'd go out to the Elkridge Club, where they had the big social things. I think the hall at Lawyers Hill became much less pretentious socially at about that time. The old ladies would still show up at the 4th of July picnic. They'd sort of all line up on a bench and talk about old times. And they really went back. You know, these people were in their 80s in the 1930s. So they went back a long way.
Were there other social events at the hall besides the theater?
Yeah, they had other things. There was tennis, as I mentioned, all year long, and then people would do other things. People would have parties at the hall. It was a good, if you didn't have room in your house, you could rent the hall, and it was a good big. Have you been in it?
Haven't been inside yet. No.
I assume they still have the playbills from all the plays mounted around the top of the walls. I hope they do, because those were interesting. Matched by that scrapbook I told you, there are probably many of them in there. And they would have, I remember both my wife and I were talking about just the other day, our memories of the hall. There was a Mrs. Davis who had a group who sort of worked with a group of children, and she referred to it as helping the hall happily, which we hated. We really hated, because we didn't like Mrs. Davis, and she organized games that we didn't want to play, the wrong kind of games. And our parents would send us there they thought it was good for us to get together with the other children. What we wanted to do was play at home. But Mrs. Davis would organize us and make us help the hall happily. And during World War II, the big deal was going out and collecting scrap metal for the war drive, aluminum and stuff like that.
Were there any, was any metal gathered from any of the houses? Was any lawn ornaments?
No, we didn't gather it that way. I think I believe we were pretty well behaved.
Yeah.
Because my wife said her first introduction to me, which I sort of remember, was this gang, this real mob of dirty little boys, ragamuffins, came over to see the new girl in town on the hill. She went inside and hid. But I don't remember us as being quite that bad. There were a bunch of us, the boys, that sort of flocked together, as kids do at age 10 or so. But and then there were, I guess mostly every now and then somebody would try and put on a play. And it was usually somebody like Mrs. Davis, okay, trying to get us children to participate in the play, and we wanted no part of that. And there was dancing class, which we also wanted no part of. Yet some of the Donaldson family are still big in amateur theatricals and games. We had an experience a number of years ago. My son was here, and his girlfriend was staying here at the time. and we were invited to Thanksgiving at the Donaldsons, who are now over in Centerville, Maryland. And it was to see Mrs. Shawver, who wrote these books here, and to have dinner and to join in the game. Well, our assumption was, well, now we're going to have to watch football on TV. But it turned out the game was not that. It was rather a game of charades. And I suffered enough, but my son and his girlfriend just about died. I mean, it was really awful, but they couldn't stand it. And that kind of thing went on at the hall, charades, and people loved it. And the Donaldson family kept it up, and they would have little. They even at home, they would after dinner, they would. What do we do tonight? Well, let's put on a play, and they would. They'd make it up. Somebody would write it, and somebody would perform it, and you get a little flavor of that from here.
Yeah.
They would perform in it and have a lot of fun with it, and they still do it.
How was the lawn regarded when you were growing up? It's such a bizarre structure.
Well, that was one of the places my grandmother would spend the winter, and I went there quite frequently. And of course, at the time she was there in the winter, they all sort of withdrew into just the central part of it that they could heat. And at that time, it was occupied by Dr. George Brown and Miss Esther Brown, his sister. Miss Esther was crippled and was deaf, and so she was to a little kid, she was kind of scary and couldn't communicate with her. And she would just sit there in her front window facing the sun and watch the birds in a bird feeder. That's all, as far as I know, that's all she did for years. She used to be, incidentally, one of the big people in theatricals. She was apparently fairly accomplished in some of these plays and so on, and she apparently was pretty good. But as a child in the 30s, she was just an old lady, a deaf old lady who was kind of scary. Dr. Brown was a delightful man. He was an extremely well-educated man. He was I think he was head librarian at the Pratt Library for many years. And I liked him very much, which, in spite of the fact that he was quite old. Frequently, we'd go into Baltimore on a train called the Doodlebug. It was a little two-car train that came down the Patapsco River Valley, stopped at Relay, and it was a commuting train in Baltimore. And Dr. Brown went in, and I had to go in once a week I'd go in for piano lessons. And he would always, I'd go with him very often, walk with him, and he would always have a topic prepared for me in the morning, and a new word. He particularly liked new words, or new sayings. And he would present this to me as we walked across the Relay Bridge, and then I would be asked questions about it on the way home. And I enjoyed it for some reason. I actually did. It's not the kind of thing that kids often like to do, but I did enjoy that. And he was a good friend of my mother's, particularly, my father's. And I remember him all the way up through college. I went to St. John's in Annapolis, and he sort of sponsored me in terms of recommending me there and just assisting in getting me accepted there. And then he came to my graduation. And that's the last I remember seeing him. I think he was when I went
Now, at that point, did the old Lawyer's Hill really go through?
Yes, that went through. I think probably I'm just guessing 1905. Oh, you mean did it?
Oh, it was still in the.
I think the new one. The new one that goes the present one.
Present one.
That went through about 1905, I think.
Okay.
The old Lawyer's Hill Road then was I don't know when it.
But you were walking at the time that you were walking to the relay station.
Yeah, we would walk down the old one. Yes, there was a path down there, and I think that's been obliterated by not the I-95, but the access to the Harbor Tunnel Thruway. Incidentally, you may well be aware there were two fortifications on the Howard County side of the Relay Bridge during the Civil War.
Yes, I remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
They were on opposite sides of the present Lawyer's Hill. There's a little, as you go down Lawyer's Hill where you come to the railroad tracks, there's a stream to the right down a deep ravine that goes on under the tracks. And up on the other side of that stream, above the railroad tracks, above the Lawyers Hill Road, was the site of one of the forts, which I think was wiped out during the highway construction.
Do you remember it?
Yes, yeah, because I used to go up and find bullets and buttons, coat buttons, and pieces of old guns and things like that.
As far as any structure, was there any?
It was just an earthwork, sort of the hill went down steep like that, and then they'd sort of cut away behind and heaped up in front, so there was a gun in place. I think they had a gun or two there, probably a very big gun. For obvious reasons, they wanted to protect the Relay Bridge. It's the only railroad link from north to south. Yeah. And there was another fortification on the old Lawyers Hill Road side, between the old Lawyers Hill Road and the new Lawyers Hill Road. And I think probably the highway got it too, what was left of it. I do know that before the highway came through, the people with metal detectors went through it and picked up anything that was worth finding. There were one similar fortification back of the Relay House on the other side. I don't know its status at all. But
what do you recall of the Relay House?
I don't remember any of the interior except for the waiting room, which was a big, dirty room with a big iron stove in the middle, and the usual loafer sitting around the stove, and a couple of grill work windows where you'd buy tickets. And then there was a big, long platform and sort of a waiting shed on the opposite side of the tracks.
It was sort of on its last leg, I think.
Yeah, they closed it as a hotel.
Yeah.
And what I remember about it more than anything else was that it was filthy. It was really dirty from the soot. I mean, it had, at that time, it was close to 100 years of soot on it.
Yeah.
And when they finally tore down the station, my parents bought a lot of the interior shutters, the panel shutters inside, and they paneled their house with it. And then also they had sort of stone ornaments on top with iron lightning rods, which my aunt and uncle used for gatepost ornaments. I have a picture of those somewhere.
Where are they now? The ornaments?
They're at this was the Rugby House. Oh. They're as gatepost. I assume they're still there. I don't know. We sold the place a few years ago. But and then of course the footbridge I remember very well. It was kind of scary to walk across there. It hangs out, as you probably saw, over the river, and when a train's going by, it's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And, as a kid, I would not be sure whether I wanted to be on the side of the river or on the side of the train, walking with my father across there.
Now, there are a number of fairly recent, I would say the last couple of decades, old ranch-type houses scattered in among the older estates. Was that a result of sort of post-war subdivisions? People deciding that they didn't need it?
I think, there was one group of those up near Montgomery Road. There were about, I guess there were 4 or 5 ranch houses, and then there was 1 or 2 two-story houses and a couple more ranch houses that were built all in the 50s, I think. Maybe some of them a little bit early. And then as you come down Lawyers Hill Road, even coming along the middle part of Lawyers Hill Road where it dips down, there were 1 or 2 along there as well. It's near the...
Yeah, here and here. Well, actually, that's Bonnywood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there was... This is the Steads, and this is the McSherrys. And this is a older house. Hi! It's an older house. This house, I think, is the older house. I'm not sure what that is. I don't remember that now.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty new one.
Yeah, this is a ranch house here, a little brick Hi, Brent.
Hello.
My wife, Frances.
Hi, good to meet you.
Hi. Having a wonderful discussion.
Deep into all sorts of
We're in the Lawyer's Hill. You want to come here and help?
I don't think so.
Well, you would. I was talking about helping the whole happily here at one point. I don't know how you enjoyed that.
I'm gonna put together a little lunch. Would you all like some lunch?
Sounds fine.
Sounds wonderful.
Good time?
Sure.
Okay, then Bonnie Woodcross is the brick.
Now, was that where Edgewood was? What about Edgewood? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, Edgewood, and I think that was Edgewood.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Because this apparently was on the site of the larger house that burned.
Yeah, which was a Donaldson house, I believe. Let me see. Well, let me continue with these things. This was the Mrs. Dobbins house. My father did a lot of additions to that porch and modifications inside about 19... yeah, after the war, 1950 or so. Late 40s, early 50s, I think. And then... the Elkridge assembly rooms, we've talked about it a good bit.
Now, is this accurate about the time of the rebuilding there?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
And the reason I say yes is that the lady who did this, I don't remember her name now, checked all these out with my Aunt Mary Morris, who lived over Brooklyn. And she would have gotten the information from her, and it would have been a lot better than my information. So it's a lot more accurate than mine would be. I think this information is probably reasonably accurate as far as it goes. Oh, we're talking about tennis courts.
Oh, yeah, there's a little grassy
Flat,
area there.
right. It's not.
Do you have any idea of the architect?
No.
No.
It couldn't have been my grandfather because it was built too early. I think.
Your
Of course,
grandfather practiced in
let's see, well, he didn't practice. He started practice about 1870. Yeah, but that was up in Newport, Rhode Island. He did a couple of those so-called cottages up there.
Did he really? Which ones? I was just up there.
He did the Shamrock Cliffs, it's called now. It's a hotel.
Okay.
It's I believe it's frame, I think, and it's towards the bay. It's right down near the point between the bay and the sound. It's not out to the east. It's
not grouped with
the big stone, the breakers and places like that. And then my father did the gatehouse to that, which is in itself is a huge house.
The gatehouse to the gate?
Yeah, no, to the Shamrock Cliffs, and it in itself is a big house. They were owned by the Winans family in Baltimore. And my grandfather, he started out. He was secretary to the Winans family, and they were the Hutton family. I don't know how they were interrelated. They built the engineers and builders of the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, my grandfather was secretary towards the latter part while they were doing that, and then he went to the Maryland Institute in art and architecture and drifted in. And Mr. Winans died, and he became an architect. Okay. The Edwardstead. I really didn't answer your question, but I'm sort of picking these up as we get to them. The Edwardstead house, which is the Gables, I knew pretty well. My Uncle Murray Worthington lived there. It had been his wife. She was nearest in. She and her brother owned it together. And then, just after the war, they sold out to Edwardstead, and they moved up to
Now that predates most of the.
Yes, and that was a Dorsey house, and I was looking. I've got a picture somewhere of the Dorsey who built it, and I was looking for the dates on it. This may have the dates, but it's yes. They were. I don't remember exactly how tied into the Belmont Dorseys, but they were very closely into that, and so that was one of the early places. The early places to be split off from Belmont, or from Rockford, really, was because when originally it was Moore's Morning Choice, and they split that into Belmont and Rockford, and Rockford was the Laurie's Hill side, and they were both Dorseys on both sides. One married a Hanson, and one married Murray.
And then those subsequently were subdivided for children again.
Yeah. The last subdivision was 1900 when the Anna Morris Murray, Mrs. Francis T. Murray, subdivided, and that was the plat I showed you earlier. So, but there was earlier subdivision. Mary Dorsey inherited Rockburn in, well, actually, 1799 was when her father died, but she didn't get it until 1850 because of problems with the will. And they slowly sold off pieces. She and her husband, Daniel Murray, sold off pieces until he died in 1840. And I think this one maybe was one of those.
So is that where Dobbins first bought his?
And
his parcel?
I think he bought his. I believe he bought his from Hockley. Let me show you a plan. I'll bring it in.
Okay.
Incidentally, this write-up will have references to pictures that are not in here. I'm sorry about that, but they're being developed, and I don't have any copies of that. But I do have a couple of things that I don't know whether it'd be used to you. There's ancestors of the Murrays, which would not be of much interest to you because that didn't involve that involved Annapolis and Eastern Shore and so on. There's also the relationship with Francis Scott Key, you probably know, was hung out a bit at Rockford. He was a friend of Danny Murray. And he was there when Danny Murray died. He spent a lot of time there. In spite of the fact that the people at Rockburn once said that he came home and finished off the Star Spangled Banner there, that's not true, because they didn't own Rockburn. In fact, Rockburn was just a little office for the iron mines at that time. Okay, there's an ancestry of Mary Dorsey, which I don't know whether they have any use to you, but it's extremely complex Dorsey background. And if you run into Dorsey names, but that's not what I'm looking for.
The earliest reference I found I was tracing the Latrobe deed back, and he purchased his property from Andrew Ellicott.
Yeah. Well, okay, here's what I was looking for. Okay, Tapsco River and the Laurie's Hill Road. And then this chunk here was Hockley. Cut out of, and this then is Rockburn like this. Sort of stuff. And the Laurie's Hill Road, you can see a lot of it, the lower part of it, was in Hockley rather than in Rockburn. Rockburn had this. Let's see if I can. This piece. Now, some of this is where it starts down. The hall, I think, is about here. Where it starts down the hill. But I think the Dobbin property. I know my grandparents, whose house was here, bought a piece of property like this from the Dobbins, and that was all Hockley. And I think the Dobbins also were down this way. Somewhere else, well, I don't know where it is now, but anyway, somewhere else I saw where I know the Ellicotts bought the Avalon Forge, which was this. And at that time, I think the Anne Arundel County, Howard County line was not the Patapsco River. It was up at the top of the hill, along here. And they owned some property here, and the river moved around a good bit during the various floods. It moved back and forth across the flat area down there. So I think a lot of this was some of this was Elkridge. And the Elkridge tended to buy in. I think they bought Hockley Mill. They bought that was competition, and that was a grist mill. That was also a nail factory and ironworks down here too.
Now, the building that survives there, right by